In this video, we're going to be learning about the simplest form of neural pathway, which are what we call reflex arcs. Now, if you think of actions that occur by reflex in the body, chances are you're thinking of a process that happens automatically, meaning that the process is an involuntary process rather than a voluntary one. A different way of describing how this occurs is any process in the body that is taken without any active thought in doing so, meaning that these processes that are called reflexes do not directly involve the brain. Now, how exactly is this possible, and why does it need to bypass the brain entirely? Well, all reflex arcs begin the same way that all action is taken in the body. It begins with a stimulus from the environment that stimulates some sort of sensory organ, and that information would normally be transferred to the brain. However, if we take a look at the stimulus in this case, we can see that this pin here is piercing through the surface of the skin. So therefore, in this case, the skin is the obvious sensory organ in this case, and the stimulus is actually going to be perceived by us as extreme pain, and it looks like this is quite bad. For anybody that has ever stepped on a nail before, you'll know that this is no laughing matter. Now, the sensory organ, recognizing that something has breached the surface of the skin, is going to be stimulated, and the action potential begins in the first neuron of the reflex arc, and this, not surprisingly, is what we call a sensory neuron. So the job of sensory neurons is to receive the input signal from the receptor that exists in the sensory organ, in this case the skin, and normally the job of a sensory organ is to transmit that information to the central nervous system, which again would firstly be the spinal cord, and then ultimately that information would go to the brain. So normally the brain is the organ that decides the course of action that should be taken based on the stimulus. However, in this case, this stimulus is causing rather severe harm to the body, because if this pin has breached the surface of the skin, it's possibly cut into blood vessels, muscle tissue, and depending on where this pin has pierced, possibly even vital organs. So the idea is that this stimulus, because it's causing immediate danger to the body involving the brain, will take too long in order to cause the body to get to choose an appropriate response, thereby perpetuating the amount of possible damage. So in this case, we actually see that instead of having the action potential transmitted to the center of the spine, let's just spell the word potential properly first. Instead of transmitting the action potential to the center of the spine where it would be carried up to the brain, instead it's transmitted to an intermediary neuron that is found within the vertebrae of your backbone, but are actually distinct from the spinal cord. These can be what we call relay neurons. However, the term intermediate neuron, or interneuron for short, is more commonly used. So these interneurons, which are found again within the vertebrae, the individual bones of the backbone, receive the information from the sensory neuron, and recognizing that this is an extreme danger signal, transmit that information directly to the next neuron in the chain instead of using the central nervous system, meaning that this information bypasses the spinal cord and the brain entirely. Now, obviously, we need to do something about this pin being here. If we stepped on this pin, the obvious reflex that we would respond to is lifting our foot out of it so that the breach of the skin would stop, which means that we would need to transmit that signal to a muscle. And for that, the action potential is transmitted by the interneuron to a neuron that in this case is connected to a muscle, and these are what we call motor neurons. So not all motor neurons are connected to muscles, but we say that motor neurons are neurons that are connected to effectors, and their job normally is to transmit the response signal from the brain to the effector in order to best respond to the stimulus in this case. Now, as mentioned before, effectors are simply any part of the body that can directly cause change in response to the stimulus, and muscles are one possible option if the response involves movement in some way, which obviously it would in this case, because the simple response to stepping on a sharp pin like this is lifting your foot, getting it out of the way, and minimizing any possible damage that exists. But many other reflexes are not actually involved with movement at all. One of the most characteristic involuntary responses is your mouth getting wet whenever you feel hungry, which is mediated by the salivary glands in your mouth. So effectors that produce chemicals or result in some sort of chemical reaction change rather than causing movement are simply what we refer to as glands. This concludes the first part in our series on the structure of the nervous system, the structure of neurons, and the overall structure of a reflex arc. Before the next series of videos where we look at what action potential is directly, take a look at this case study involving hunger, as hunger is probably one of the easiest and most commonly understood examples of a reflex, because everybody gets hungry, and you don't really need to cause yourself to feel hunger. It is a natural response based on specific stimuli in your environment. So take a look at this case study and see if you can put your knowledge of neuron structure and the structure of a reflex arc to good use.